This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and military operations depicted are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This story is not affiliated with or endorsed by the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. The plaster came off in slabs. Thatcher Graves swung the pry bar into the seam where the lathe met the stud, and the wall gave up another piece of itself. A chunk the size of a dinner plate, trailing horsehair and dust that had been settling since before he was born. He set the pry bar down and ran his left hand flat across the exposed surface. Fingertips first, then palm. Slow, deliberate. Reading the wall the way he'd read every wall for 3 years. The way he'd read walls for 18 years before that, when the stakes were different and the walls held worse things than plaster. Duke lay 4 feet from the toolbox, chin on paws, ears tracking Thatcher's movements without lifting his head. The German shepherd had positioned himself where he could see both the doorway to the kitchen and the window facing the county road. Nobody had taught him that. He'd arrived at the geometry on his own, the same way he'd arrived at most of his operational instincts, through attention and repetition, and whatever lived behind those dark eyes that Thatcher had stopped trying to name. December light came through the west-facing window at a hard angle, catching the dust Thatcher had raised and turning it into a slow column of gold. The house was limestone and cedar, built in the 1940s by someone who understood both materials. Set on a half-acre lot at the southern edge of Corbin Hollow, Texas. Hill country. Cedar-choked draws and limestone shelves and live oaks that held their leaves through winter while everything else went bare. Thatcher had bought the place 6 weeks ago for $62,000 cash from an estate sale. The previous owner, an Ida Collier, had died in June. Heart failure, the listing agent said. He swung again. The pry bar bit into the wall, and something shifted behind the lathe. Something that didn't sound like plaster or wood or the crumbled mortar he'd been pulling out all morning. He stopped. Duke's head came up. Thatcher set the pry bar on the floor. He pulled the work lamp closer and angled it into the gap he'd opened. Behind the lathe, set back against the exterior stone, there was a cavity. Intentional. Somebody had framed out a pocket between the interior wall and the exterior limestone, roughly 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide, and placed something inside it, wrapped in waxed canvas. He reached in with his left hand. His right stayed free. The canvas was stiff with age, but intact. And inside it, he could feel the rigid edges of what turned out to be a ledger. Leather-bound, thick, the pages swollen slightly with decades of absorbed humidity. He pulled it out and held it under the lamp. Duke was standing now. Not alert standing, watching standing. His ears were forward, head level, weight even on all 4 legs. The posture he took when something had changed in the environment, and he was waiting to see what Thatcher would do about it. Thatcher opened the ledger. The handwriting was small and precise, written in blue ink that had faded toward gray. Columns of names, dates, and dollar amounts. The first entry was dated March 1961. The last, November 2023. 7 months before Ida Collier died. Hundreds of entries, maybe thousands. He turned to the final page. Below the last entry, In handwriting that matched the rest but trembled slightly at the edges, someone had written a single line in darker ink, pressed harder into the paper. "He'll come for this. Don't let him." Duke growled, low, from deep in his chest, directed at the window. Thatcher looked up. The county road was empty. Live oaks, a fence line, the neighbor's mailbox 60 yards south. Nothing moved. But Duke's attention held on that window for another 8 seconds before he settled, and Thatcher noted it. 8 seconds was a long time in Duke's vocabulary. It meant something had been there. A vehicle slowing, a figure at the tree line, a scent carried on the December air. And then wasn't. Easy. Thatcher's voice dropped half a register, the way it always did when he spoke to the dog. He set the ledger on the kitchen table and rested his hand on Duke's head. "Easy, buddy. We're good." Duke leaned into the touch. His eyes stayed on the window. That night, Thatcher sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the overhead light that still buzzed on a bad ballast. Duke had moved to his usual position, lying against the wall where the kitchen met the hallway, facing the front door. The house had 2 exterior doors and 5 windows. Duke had mapped all of them in the first 20 minutes after they'd moved in. Thatcher had done the same thing, except he'd done it in 4. The ledger told a story. It took Thatcher an hour to understand the shape of it, and another hour to understand that the shape had a hole in it. Ida Collier had been running what amounted to a private lending operation for 15 years. Small amounts, 200 here, 800 there, once 1,500 for a family whose name Thatcher recognized from the closing documents as the previous owners of the hardware store on the town's main road. The terms were consistent across every loan. No interest, no collateral, repayment whenever possible, forgiveness when it wasn't. She'd been lending to her neighbors at rates that would make a bank's compliance officer laugh and then cry. The names were all local. Thatcher had heard most of them in the 6 weeks since he'd arrived. At the lumberyard, the feed store, the one restaurant that served breakfast before 7. Small-town names, small-town amounts. Every loan documented with the precision of someone who respected money enough to track it and cared about people enough to give it away. But 6 entries didn't fit. They appeared between 2019 and 2023, scattered among the personal loans. Different ink, black instead of blue. Different handwriting, still Ida's, but tighter, smaller, pressed harder into the page. And the amounts were wrong. 15,000, 22,000, 40,000. The names weren't names. They were abbreviations. BLCR Holdings, Mesquite Ridge, LLC, Kalichi Partners. No addresses, no repayment terms, no notes in the margins explaining what the money was for, which Ida had done for every single personal loan, down to the specific roof repair or medical bill. These 6 entries sat in the ledger like stones in a garden. They belonged to a different system entirely. Duke raised his head and set his chin on Thatcher's boot. He did this when the texture of Thatcher's breathing changed, when something had shifted inside and the body was processing it before the mind caught up. What'd she get herself into, buddy? Duke's eyes moved up to Thatcher's face, stayed there. Thatcher closed the ledger. His left hand lay flat on the cover. The fingers of his right hand opened and closed once, slowly, the way they did when he was running a problem through his body instead of his head. 18 years in the teams had taught him to process information this way, physically, kinetically, routing the data through muscles and tendons instead of language, letting the pattern emerge from the body's own geometry rather than forcing it through words. He looked at the wall he'd opened that morning. The exposed lathe and limestone, the cavity where the ledger had been hidden. Someone had built that pocket deliberately, measured it, framed it, sealed it behind plaster that matched the rest of the wall perfectly. This wasn't a woman who'd tossed a book behind the drywall in a panic. This was preparation, planning. And the note. He'll come for this. Not they, not someone. He. Ida Collier had known exactly who she was hiding the ledger from. One person. One man. Thatcher had spent 18 years walking into rooms where the information wasn't complete, where the map didn't match the terrain, where the thing you could see was never the thing that killed you. The thing that killed you was in the wall. His left shoulder tightened, a slow, deep pull along the muscle where shrapnel had torn through the deltoid 3 years and 4 months ago. He didn't reach for it. He didn't adjust. He sat with it the way he sat with everything his body carried, by acknowledging it existed and choosing not to let it drive. He stood, picked up the ledger, and put it in the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator. Behind the box of dog biscuits Duke knew was there and spent approximately 10% of his waking hours pretending he didn't. Then he filled Duke's water bowl, checked the front door lock, checked the back door lock, and went to the bedroom. Duke followed. He positioned himself against the wall between the bed and the door, facing out. Thatcher lay in the dark. The ceiling was cracked plaster he hadn't gotten to yet. Through the window, he could see a single light from a house a quarter-mile east, and beyond it, the black fold of the hills against a sky full of December stars. His left hand lay at his side, palm down, fingers slightly spread, the same position it had been in when he'd reached into the wall. The same position it had been in, years ago, a continent away, when he'd pressed it flat against the exterior wall of a compound in a province he was not permitted to name, and declared the wall clear, and stepped aside, and Petty Officer Second Class Mateo Ruiz had walked through the doorway behind him. He closed his eyes. Duke's breathing was steady against the wall, slow in, slow out, the metronome that had replaced all the other metronomes. He was awake before the light. He'd always been awake before the light. Duke was already standing by the back door, not requesting, just indicating readiness. Thatcher let him out, started coffee in the percolator he'd found in the house's kitchen, and cleaned to an operational state, and stood at the back door watching Duke move through the yard. The property ran 160 feet behind the house before it hit a cedar break. Beyond that, the terrain climbed toward the draws, where juniper and post oak held the limestone shelves together. Duke covered the yard in his standard pattern, perimeter first, then the interior, nose down, cataloging what had come through during the night. Deer, something smaller, maybe a fox, a neighbor's cat that had been making incursions from the east. The coffee was ready when Duke scratched at the door. Thatcher poured 1 cup, set a bowl of kibble on the floor, and sat at the kitchen table facing the window and the road beyond it. His back was to the wall. The ledger sat in the cabinet. He hadn't opened it again. He didn't need to. The 6 entries were in his head. Names that weren't names, amounts that didn't belong, and a dead woman's handwriting warning him that someone would come looking. A vehicle he hadn't heard before turned off the county road onto the short gravel drive. Thatcher registered it before Duke did by half a second. Engine pitch, tire crunch pattern, weight distribution from the suspension behavior. Mid-size sedan, not a truck. Nobody in Corbin Hollow drove a sedan except the mail carrier, and the mail carrier came at 2. Duke's head came up from the kibble. His body went from eating to operational in the time it took Thatcher to set down his coffee cup. The dog moved to the window, then to the door, ears forward, tail level. "Fuss!" Thatcher said it without raising his voice. Duke came to his left side and held. The sedan pulled to a stop. A woman got out, late 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing pressed slacks and a blazer that didn't belong to ranch country. She had a clipboard and a leather bag and the posture of someone who'd been through a professional door before and expected it to open when she approached. Her eyes moved across the front of the house before she moved her feet, scanning, assessing, reading the property. Thatcher watched her do it. He recognized the behavior. Different context, same instinct. She was looking for things that didn't match. Duke broke protocol before she reached the porch. He pushed through the screen door. Thatcher hadn't latched it, and trotted down the 3 steps to the walkway. The woman stopped. 80 pounds of German Shepherd was moving toward her at a pace that could have been friendly, or could have been something else. And the distinction mattered. She didn't step back. She crouched, set the clipboard on her knee, and offered the back of her hand. Duke sniffed it. His tail moved once, twice, and then he leaned into her palm when she scratched behind his ear. Thatcher stood in the doorway. Duke didn't do that. Not with strangers. Not in 6 weeks of people coming to the house. The propane delivery driver, the county inspector, the kid from the lumber yard. Duke tolerated them. He didn't lean. He doesn't usually do that. The woman looked up. Dogs know things. She straightened, picked up the clipboard. Thatcher Graves? Yes, ma'am. Marisol Vane, County Auditor's Office. I'm doing a routine follow-up on the property transfer. The Collier estate sale flagged some documentation gaps in our records. She held up a folder. Can I ask you a few questions about the purchase? He stepped back from the doorway. Come in. She walked past him into the kitchen. Her eyes moved the way his had when he'd first entered the house. Exits, sight lines, the general condition of the space. She clocked the half-demolished wall in the back room, the pry bar on the floor, the work lamp still angled into the cavity. She clocked the toolbox, the dust, the drop cloth. And she clocked the ledger. It was sitting on the kitchen table. He'd taken it down from the cabinet that morning to look at the 6 entries one more time, and he hadn't put it back. Her expression changed. Not dramatically. A narrowing around the eyes, a shift in weight from her back foot to her front, a realignment of attention. She was looking at the ledger the way Duke had looked at the window the night before, like it was the only thing in the room. Where did you find that? Her voice wasn't casual anymore. In the wall. Silence. 3 seconds. Duke sat between them, head turning from one to the other. May I see it? No. She held his look. He held hers. There was nothing hostile in either direction, just two people establishing where the lines were drawn before anyone stepped over them. "Mr. Graves, I'm not here to cause you trouble, but if that's what I think it is, you should know that I handle the county's financial records, and Ida Collier's estate had irregularities that my office has been trying to resolve for 6 months. Property valuations that don't match market data, shell company names on transfer documents, gaps in the chain of title." Thatcher said nothing. "I'm not accusing you of anything, but you bought this house through a sale that my office flagged. You're tearing out walls, and you've got a handwritten ledger sitting on your kitchen table. From where I'm standing, that's either a coincidence or it isn't. I'm a carpenter. I bought a house. I'm fixing it. That's all I do." "That's all you do?" He didn't answer. She waited. Duke's tail swept the floor once, as if marking time. "I'd like a copy of the ledger for my records." "I'll think about it." She pulled a card from the leather bag and set it on the table, next to the ledger. Her fingers came within 2 inches of the cover and stopped. "Ms. Collier helped a lot of people in this town. Whatever's in that book, people here remember her as a saint. Saints don't hide things in walls." Her eyes shifted to his. Something moved in them. A calculation, a reassessment, the gears of a mind that processed information the way his processed threat. Quickly, thoroughly, with a bias toward assuming the worst until the evidence said otherwise. She left without shaking his hand. She did stop to scratch Duke behind the ear one more time, and the dog leaned into it again, tail moving, eyes half closed. Thatcher watched her sedan pull onto the county road and disappear south. Then he looked at Duke. "You're supposed to be a better judge of character than me." Duke looked up. His tail moved. "Or maybe you are." She came back the next day. This time, she brought files. Thatcher was on the roof, patching a section where the cedar shakes had separated and moisture had gotten into the decking. His left shoulder had stiffened in the cold morning air and was limiting his overhead reach, which meant every third swing of the roofing hammer required him to pause and reset his grip. He didn't acknowledge it beyond the pause. The body did what the body did. Duke was below, lying in a patch of sun by the front steps, when Marisol's sedan pulled in. This time, the dog stood and met her at the car door. She had a box of files under one arm and a paper cup of coffee in the other hand, and she navigated Duke's greeting with the ease of someone who'd grown up around dogs. "Mr. Graves." He looked down from the roof. "Ms. Vane?" "I have something you need to see. Can you come down?" He climbed down the ladder. His right knee caught on the second-to-last rung, the cartilage that had been grinding since his last deployment overseas, sending a quick, familiar heat through the joint. He didn't limp. He stepped off the ladder and faced her with his weight centered, hands free. She'd set the files on the hood of her sedan. Manila folders, county seals, printouts. She opened the first one and spread 3 documents side by side. "I went back to the office last night, pulled the property transfer records for every transaction involving the names in that ledger, the ones I could read through the window. I have very good eyes, Mr. Graves." He didn't smile, but he didn't walk away. 3 of the entities in Miss Collier's ledger, BLCR Holdings, Mesquite Ridge LLC, and Kalichi Partners, match shell companies on property transactions filed with the county between 2019 and 2023. These properties were bought and sold between these entities multiple times, each time at 30 to 40% above the previous price. No improvements, no tenants, no actual economic activity. She let that sit. Someone was washing money through your landlady's loan system. Duke had positioned himself between them, facing outward, watching the road. He wasn't alert. He was posted, covering the approach while his people worked. Nobody had asked him to do this. It was instinct, or training, or the line between those two things that Thatcher had stopped trying to find. Thatcher looked at the documents. He didn't touch them. He read them standing, the way he'd read field intelligence, taking in the layout, the structure, the relationships between data points before committing to any single conclusion. If there was a system, there was an operator. If there was an operator, the operator was still here. Money laundering through small-town real estate didn't run itself. Someone had created the shell companies, filed the paperwork, coordinated the transactions, and, most critically, chosen Ida Collier's lending operation as the foundation, because her reputation made everything built on top of it look clean. Who files the property transfers for the county? The county clerk's office processes them, but they're submitted by the parties involved, usually through a local broker or attorney. Who's the local broker? She hesitated. Not long, a quarter second. But Thatcher had spent 18 years reading the gap between a question and its answer, and a quarter second was a canyon. There are 3 licensed brokers in Corbin Hollow. The most active one is Rayburn Cook. The name meant nothing to him. Not yet. Who's Rayburn Cook? Ida Collier's nephew. Duke's ear flicked. A truck was passing on the county road. Heavy, diesel, moving north at road speed. Normal traffic. But Duke tracked it until the sound faded past the cedar brake, and Thatcher noted the direction and the weight class, and filed both without conscious effort. How well do you know him? Everyone in Corbin Hollow knows Rayburn. He sells real estate. He coaches the middle school's basketball team. He runs the 4th of July barbecue. She paused. And he handled the sale of this house. He sold me this house. He sold you this house. Silence. Duke's tail brushed Thatcher's boot. The coffee in Marisol's paper cup was cooling, a curl of steam still visible in the December air. You said numbers don't lie yesterday. What did you mean by that? She looked at him. Her jaw tightened slightly, then released. I meant exactly what I said. Numbers are the only thing in my life that have never changed their story, depending on who was asking. People lie. Institutions lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you what happened. He nodded once. He understood the shape of that sentence, what was underneath it, what it had cost her to build a worldview on that foundation. He didn't ask what had broken her trust in people. He didn't need to. The answer was in the way she held the files, tight, precise, protecting the data the way someone protects a language they've learned to speak after their first language failed them. I'll look at the ledger again tonight. Cross-reference the dates with your documents. If the entries match, you'll get your copy. Thank you. She gathered the files. Duke stood when she stood, walked her to the car, and accepted one more scratch behind the ear. Thatcher watched from the porch. His left hand rested on the railing he'd replaced last week. Cedar, hand-sanded, fitted clean. When the sedan was gone, he looked down at Duke. The dog looked back up at him, tongue out, tail easy. Thatcher went inside and took the ledger down from the cabinet. 3 days later, Thatcher drove to town. Corbin Hollow occupied a 3-block stretch of a farm-to-market road in the western hill country. A courthouse, a hardware store, a cafe that served as the town's de facto parliament, a feed store, 2 churches, and a gas station that also sold bait and deer corn. The kind of place where everyone's truck was recognizable by sound, and a stranger's vehicle drew comment within the hour. He parked in front of the hardware store. Duke stayed in the truck bed, lying against the toolbox, watching. Thatcher had left both windows cracked and the tonneau cover open. Duke didn't need to be told to stay. He needed to be told when not to. The hardware store was run by a woman named Jenny Barstow, 71 years old, with hands that had been mixing paint and cutting glass since before Thatcher's parents had met. She greeted him the way she greeted everyone, by name, by what they'd last purchased, and by whatever she'd noticed about their vehicle on the way in. "Mornin', Mr. Graves. That cedar deck stain working out for you?" "Yes, ma'am. Need some more roofing nails. Galvanized, 1.25 inches. She pulled the box from the shelf behind the counter without checking. "How's the Collier place coming along? Ida would have been glad someone's taking care of it." "Coming along. Walls need work." She loved that house. Lived there 40-some years. Never missed a property tax payment. Never let the yard go. She was good people, Ida. Helped half the folks in this county when they needed it. "I've been hearing that. She have much family here?" "Rayburn Cook, her sister's boy. He's been around since, I don't know, 20 years at least. Sells real estate. Good man. Takes care of people." "I met him. Sold me the house." "That's Ray. Handles most of the property around here." Thatcher paid for the nails. He asked one more question on his way out, framed loosely, aimed at the edge of what Jenny would discuss without feeling interrogated. "Miss Collier passed suddenly, or was she sick?" "Heart gave out. She was 78. We all expected it, I suppose, though you never really expect it." Ray found her. He'd been bringing her groceries, checking on her. He took it hard. I imagine he did. The cafe was called Meridian, and it occupied the ground floor of a limestone building across from the courthouse. Thatcher went in because he needed to see Rayburn Cook in a space where Cook was comfortable, where the man's patterns would be natural and readable. He chose a table against the back wall facing the door. 2 exits, front door, and a service entrance through the kitchen. 6 occupied tables. The waitress was in her 50s, efficient, knew every customer. She brought coffee without being asked because she'd seen Thatcher once before and had filed his order permanently. "Thank you, ma'am." He waited. Duke was in the truck outside the window, visible from Thatcher's seat. Rayburn Cook walked in at 11:15. Mid-50s, thinning brown hair, a face that had been friendly for so long the muscles had set that way. He wore a ranch jacket over a button-down and moved through the cafe with the ease of someone whose name was on every greeting card and whose handshake was available to anyone who wanted it. He saw Thatcher and came over with his hand already extended. "Mr. Graves, how's the old Collier place treating you?" Thatcher took the handshake. Firm, practiced. Not the grip of a man measuring strength, the grip of a man selling trust, pressing it into the other man's palm like a business card. Coming along? Lot of wall work. Lord, yes. Ida hadn't touched those interior walls in decades. I told her, Aunt Ida, you've got to let somebody in there with a plasterer's hawk before the whole thing goes. But she liked it the way it was. She was stubborn about that house. Thatcher listened. His coffee was untouched. Under the table, his hands were open, resting on his thighs. He was reading Cook the way he'd read rooms downrange, in any of the places they'd sent him where the furniture was arranged and the smiles were positioned. Not for what was there, but for what was placed, what was offered for him to find, and what was hidden for him to miss. Cook sat down uninvited. The comfort of it, the assumption that the chair was available, told Thatcher something. This man owned the spaces he entered, not with force, with warmth. You knew her well, your aunt. Raised me half the time after my folks split. She was more mother than aunt, truth be told. She'd have loved knowing someone was taking care of that place. She always said that house would outlast her. It did. It did. Cook looked at his hands on the table. Heart gave out in June. I found her in the living room. She looked peaceful at least. Small mercy. Thatcher watched the performance. It was polished, it was warm, and it was a performance. He knew this the way a point man knew when the terrain didn't match the map. Not through evidence, but through the gap between what he could see and what his body was telling him. The words were right. The emotion was placed correctly. The pauses were measured. But Cook's left hand, resting on the table, had curled slightly when Thatcher said, "Walls." And his eyes had moved, briefly, reflexively, to the window, toward the truck, toward the house they were both pretending was just a house. Duke was watching from the truck bed, ears forward, tail still. Thatcher finished his coffee. He told Cook it was good to meet him, thanked the waitress, and walked out into the cold December sun. He stopped beside the truck and looked back through the cafe window. Cook was still sitting at the table, alone now, looking at his phone. "What do you think?" Duke's tail didn't move. He watched Thatcher with steady eyes and offered nothing. "Yeah, me neither." He drove home. On the way, he passed a small white church set back from the road behind a pair of live oaks whose branches made a canopy over the gravel parking lot. There was a bulletin board by the front steps, protected by a glass case. He slowed enough to read it. Wednesday supper. All welcome. 6 p.m. He didn't stop, but he slowed. And Duke, riding in the truck bed with his nose to the wind, turned his head and watched the church slide past, then looked at Thatcher through the rear window. They drove home in silence, the hills folding around them, the road white with caliche dust, the afternoon light going gold at the edges, the way it did in December, when the days were short and the shadows were long, and the year was almost done pretending it had anywhere left to go. The lumberyard on the east side of Corbin Hollow was called Jessup's, and it had sold Thatcher $400 worth of white oak trim and cedar sheaving over the past month, without a single complication. The owner, a man named Porter Jessup, had placed his orders the same day, loaded his truck himself, and once sent his son back with a board he'd decided wasn't straight enough after Thatcher had already paid for it. On Thursday morning, Thatcher walked in to order replacement joists for the back room floor, and found Porter behind the counter looking at something on his phone that he put away too quickly. "Morning, Graves." No mister this time. "What can I do for you?" "Need 8-foot joists, 2x10. Southern yellow pine if you've got it." Porter didn't move toward the lumber racks. He stayed behind the counter with his hands flat on the surface, and his eyes went to the window. "I'm a little short on dimension lumber right now. Maybe try the yard over in Driscoll." "You had a full rack Tuesday." "Sold a bunch yesterday. Big order." "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of anything. Ray Cook came by yesterday, mentioned you've been going through Ida's personal things, her records, her papers. People around here don't love that. She was private." "I'm fixing her house." I know you are." Porter's hands came off the counter. He put them in his pockets and then took them out again, and the movement told Thatcher everything about the pressure the man was under. The desire to be decent, fighting the cost of being decent in a town where Rayburn Cook had spent 20 years accumulating goodwill. "Try Driscoll. They'll have what you need." Thatcher left. He sat in the truck for a minute, engine off, hands on the wheel. Duke was in the bed, watching the lumberyard door. Cook was sealing off the supply lines, not with threats, with words placed carefully in the right ears. The new guy is going through Ida's things, her personal records, private family business. In a town this size, that was enough. The social infrastructure would do the rest. People who'd been friendly would find reasons not to be. Doors that had been open would develop complications. It was pressure that didn't leave marks and didn't require evidence because it operated on something older than evidence. Loyalty, reputation, the quiet arithmetic of small-town relationships where crossing the wrong person cost more than principle was worth. Thatcher understood the tactic. He'd seen it deployed in villages overseas by men who controlled the local economy and the local narrative simultaneously. The mechanism was identical. Only the currency changed. But he didn't know how to fight it. He knew how to clear a room. He knew how to move through terrain that was trying to kill him. He didn't know how to move through a town that was trying to forget he existed. He drove home. Duke jumped from the truck bed before Thatcher had fully stopped and went straight to the backyard. Not to his usual patrol, to the pecan tree at the back corner of the property where he'd been sniffing for 2 days. This time, he didn't just sniff. He dug. "Duke, heel." The dog looked back at him. His front paws were deep in the red clay, eyes bright. He held Thatcher's gaze for 3 full seconds, then looked back at the hole. "Duke, hiya." Duke came, slowly. He circled back to Thatcher's left side and sat, but his head stayed turned toward the pecan tree, his body carrying the tension of an animal that had found something and been told to leave it. Thatcher looked at the hole. Shallow, maybe 4 inches. Red Hill country clay, dry on top, darker underneath. Whatever Duke was smelling was deeper. He filed it. Tomorrow. That night, the temperature dropped to 38. Thatcher sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands. Duke lay on the boards beside the chair, chin on forepaws, watching the cedar break go dark as the last light left the sky. The hills were quiet. A screech owl called from the draw to the south, and a second answered from the east. The pecan tree was a black shape against the sky, and the hole Duke had started was invisible in the darkness. 6 houses in 3 years. That was his record since leaving the teams. Buy, fix, sell, move. Each one better than the last. Each one someone else's home when he was done. He'd never kept a key, never left a forwarding address, never gave Duke a collar tag with a location on it, because a location implied a return, and returning implied that something would be waiting. I should sell this one and go. That's what I'd do, Duke. Fix it, sell it, move on. Duke raised his head. His ears shifted forward. He looked at Thatcher with the steady attention of an animal that had heard every version of this speech and was waiting for the one that ended differently. Thatcher set the coffee down. He put his hand on Duke's head and left it there. The dog's skull was warm under his palm. The fur was thick along the ridge between the ears. Yeah, I know. He didn't say what he knew. Duke set his chin on Thatcher's boot, and the weight of it, 8 pounds, maybe 9, held him in the chair while the owls called and the stars came out, and the town that had started closing its doors settled into its own quiet 1/2 mile north. He wasn't going to leave. He knew it. Duke knew it. The house probably knew it too. He was going to stay and pull the thread and find what Ida Collier had hidden and why, and what Rayburn Cook had done with it, and what happened to a woman whose heart gave out 7 months after she'd written, "He'll come for this," in handwriting that shook. He sat on the porch until the cold made his shoulder lock and the coffee was too bitter to drink. Then he went inside, locked both doors, and lay in the dark with Duke against the wall, breathing steady, counting the hours until the light came back and the work continued. Duke woke him at 2 in the morning, not with a bark, with a sound Thatcher had learned to read over 2 years of sleeping 4 feet from a German shepherd whose vocabulary ran deeper than most people's. A single low whine, short, directed at the back door. Thatcher was upright before the sound finished. His feet hit the floor, and his hand found the flashlight on the nightstand in the same motion, muscle memory operating on a timeline that consciousness hadn't caught up with. He didn't turn the light on. He stood in the dark and listened. Duke was at the back door, tail low, ears forward, weight shifted to his front legs. Not alarm posture, request posture. He wanted out. Easy. Thatcher moved to the kitchen window and looked through the glass without putting his face in the frame. The backyard was silver and black. December moonlight laying across the dead grass, the cedar brake a dark wall at the property line, the pecan tree a skeleton against the sky. Nothing moved. Duke whined again, same pitch, same direction. Thatcher unlocked the back door and opened it 6 inches. Duke pushed through the gap and was down the steps and across the yard before Thatcher had finished counting the available sight lines. The dog ran straight to the pecan tree, not to the spot he'd been digging. Past it, 2 feet south, where the ground dipped slightly toward the fence line. He dropped his nose and started working. Thatcher pulled on his boots and followed. The flashlight stayed off. His eyes were adjusted, and moonlight in hill country was enough to navigate by if you'd spent years navigating by less. The air was sharp, low 30s, and his breath made brief ghosts that dissolved before they reached shoulder height. Duke was digging with purpose, front paws pulling clay in rhythmic strokes, nose dipping into the hole between every third pull to check, then pulling again. He'd found the scent 2 days ago. He'd been patient. Thatcher had called him off. Now, at 2 in the morning, The dog had decided that patience had run its course. "What have you got, buddy?" Duke's paw hit something that wasn't clay. A dull sound, metal or hard plastic under 4 inches of packed earth. He nosed the object and looked up at Thatcher, then stepped back to give room. Invitation. Thatcher knelt. His right knee protested on the cold ground, and he ignored it. He reached into the hole and felt the edges of something rectangular. A tin box, roughly the size of a cigar box, wrapped in what his fingers told him was a plastic bag. Sealed. Deliberate. He pulled it free. Duke sat beside him, ears forward, breathing fast from the work, but otherwise still. Waiting. Inside the bag, inside the tin, was a second ledger. Not leather-bound like the first. Loose-leaf pages in a manila folder, held together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked, but still held. The handwriting was Ida Collier's. Thatcher recognized it immediately, but different from the first ledger. Tighter, more deliberate. Written with a black pen instead of blue, and with a pressure that said each word had been chosen and weighed before it went onto the page. He opened the folder. The first page was a list of dates and numbers, the same shell company names from the first ledger, but here they were cross-referenced with county property records. Addresses, transaction amounts, purchase prices that went in, sale prices that came out. The difference? 30, 40, sometimes 50%, highlighted with small marks in the margin that meant Ida had done the math and understood exactly what the numbers were doing. She'd built a mirror. The first ledger was the original, the record of her lending operation, with the shell company transactions hidden inside it. This second ledger was her analysis, her proof. She'd taken the data from her own books and matched it against public records, and the result was a document that didn't just show what had happened. It showed that she knew what had happened, and she'd known for years. He turned to the last page. The handwriting here was different again, looser, the letters slightly larger, the lines not quite straight. Written later, written tired or sick or afraid. One line, black ink, pressed deep enough to score the paper. He is my sister's boy. God forgive me for what I cannot stop. Thatcher read it twice. The December cold was in his hands now, and the pages trembled slightly, and he couldn't tell if that was the temperature or something else. She'd known. Not suspected. Known. She'd identified the shell companies, matched the transactions, calculated the laundering spread, and understood the entire architecture of what was being built on top of her reputation. And she had done nothing. Because the person building it was family. Because the nephew she'd helped raise, the boy she'd taken in after his parents split, the man who brought her groceries and checked on her and called her Aunt Ida, he was the one washing money through the system she'd spent 15 years constructing to help her neighbors. And then she died, 7 months after writing this page. Heart gave out, they said. She was 78. Duke pressed his body against Thatcher's leg. The dog's warmth cut through the cold at the contact point, a narrow stripe of heat along Thatcher's thigh. Good boy. Good boy, Duke. He put the folder back in the tin back in the bag. He didn't take it inside the house. The first ledger was in the cabinet above the refrigerator. If someone had been in the house, if someone had gone through Ida's walls looking for what she'd hidden, the cabinet was the first place they'd check. The second place was the truck. He went to the truck, opened the toolbox mounted behind the cab, moved the socket set, the spare headlamp bulbs, the emergency kit he'd built from habit rather than expectation. He placed the tin underneath, flat against the bottom of the box, and covered it with the socket tray. Then he closed the toolbox and locked it, key on his ring in his pocket. Duke watched from the yard, sitting in the moonlight with clay on his paws, and his attention divided between Thatcher and the road. They went inside. Thatcher washed his hands, washed Duke's paws with a damp cloth, while the dog stood patiently in the kitchen, and then sat at the table with the second ledger's final sentence running through his head on a loop that wouldn't stop. He is my sister's boy. 5 words that explained everything. The hidden ledger, the deliberate concealment, the 15 years of silence. She'd built an entire system of community lending, hundreds of loans, hundreds of families helped, and someone had attached a parasite to it. And the parasite was the boy she'd raised. And she had chosen to let the parasite feed because cutting it off meant cutting off family. And now the question that the second ledger had been buried to ask. What happened between the day Ida wrote those words and the day her heart gave out? Thatcher looked at the wall he'd opened 3 days ago. Lathe and limestone, and the cavity where the first ledger had waited. His left hand was flat on the table, fingers spread. The same position, the same read. He'd missed the wall in the compound. He'd said clear, and it wasn't, and Ruiz had walked in behind him. 3 years of tearing walls apart, looking for what he'd missed, trying to find the discipline he'd failed to apply when it mattered. And now, in a house in Corbin Hollow, Texas, a dead woman had built a wall specifically so that someone exactly like him, someone who took walls apart for a living, would find what she'd hidden. You put it where a carpenter would find it. Duke set his chin on the table and looked at Thatcher sideways. His eyebrows, the tan marks above his eyes, moved in alternating sequence, the way they did when he was reading Thatcher's internal weather. She planned this. The dog blinked once, slowly. Thatcher closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He sat at the table with his hand on the wood and the sentence in his head, and the sound of Duke's breathing marking time until dawn cracked the eastern sky, and the kitchen filled with cold light, and the day demanded its beginning. He called Marisol at 8. She answered on the second ring. I need to show you something, not on the phone. Where? The house. Bring whatever you have on the county property transfers, all of them. She arrived in 40 minutes. Duke met her at the car, and she scratched his ears, and he leaned, and for a moment the morning looked ordinary. A woman and a dog in a driveway in December. The sun low and warm on the limestone walls. It stopped looking ordinary when Thatcher set the tin on the kitchen table and opened it. They sat across from each other, the second ledger between them. Marisol read each page without speaking, turning them with 2 fingers at the corner, careful with the paper. Her laptop was open beside her. The county's property database loaded. Duke lay under the table. His body was warm against Thatcher's boot on one side, and, Thatcher noticed, against Marisol's ankle on the other. Halfway through the folder, Marisol stopped. Her finger rested on a line of numbers. A transaction from 2021. $42,000 moving through Mesquite Ridge, LLC. This is a double-entry discrepancy. She pointed at two numbers side by side. She recorded the amount that went in and the amount that came out, and the difference is $8,400. But the county transfer record for this property shows a sale price that matches neither number. It matches a third number, one that doesn't exist anywhere in the county system.
Meaning?
Meaning someone filed a transfer document with a fabricated sale price. The actual money moved through Ida's ledger at one amount, left the shell company at another, and appeared in the county records at a third. 3 different numbers for the same transaction. She looked up from the page. That's not amateur laundering. That's a 3-layer wash. Someone who knows how property records work designed this to survive a standard audit. Someone who works with property records. Someone who works with property records. The name neither of them had said sat in the room like furniture. Marisol turned to the last page. She read the sentence, "He is my sister's boy," and her hands went still on the table. She didn't look up for a long time. When she did, her eyes were different. Not harder, older. Something in them had receded to make room for a recognition that had nothing to do with county records. My father used my name to open 3 credit accounts when I was 16. She said it without preamble, without context, without the verbal architecture that people usually built around their damage to make it easier to carry into a conversation. He put $32,000 of debt on a minor's Social Security number and then disappeared. I didn't find out until I applied for my first apartment at 19 and got denied. Thatcher didn't speak. I spent 4 years repairing my credit, disputing charges, writing letters to collection agencies that had already sold the debt to other collection agencies. I was 23 before I could qualify for a car loan. She touched the edge of the last page. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you what happened. That's why you audit. That's why I audit. Duke shifted under the table. His chin moved from Thatcher's boot to the floor between them, and his tail brushed Marisol's shoe in a slow sweep. She reached down and rested her hand on his head without looking, the way someone touches a railing while reading. Automatic, stabilizing, unconscious. Thatcher pushed his coffee cup across the table toward her. She'd brought her own, but it was empty, and his was half full. She looked at the cup, then at him. Something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not the lurch of attraction in a movie, or the click of recognition in a novel. Something smaller and more honest. The recalibration of 2 people who had been holding each other at professional distance and had just, without planning to, set down enough personal weight to change the geometry. She took the cup, drank, set it back between them. I need to run these numbers through the full database, cross-reference every entity, every transaction date, every property. If the pattern holds across all 6 entries, we're looking at $600,000 minimum washed through the county's property system in 5 years. Run them. If I open this inquiry officially, It triggers a notification to the county clerk's office. Everyone who processes property transfers will know someone's pulling records. And Cook will know within an hour. Within the hour. Run them anyway. She closed the laptop, gathered the county files, left the second ledger on the table. It was his, legally, found on his property. At the door, she paused. The first ledger, the one from the wall, where is it? Cabinet above the fridge, behind the dog biscuits. You should move it, Duke would agree. She almost smiled. Almost. It made it as far as her eyes before her jaw caught it and held it somewhere between professional composure and the beginning of something that required more time than either of them had given it. She left. Thatcher watched the sedan pull away. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame he'd sanded and fitted 2 weeks ago. His other hand hung at his side, open. Duke sat beside him, looking up. His tail moved once. Don't start. 3 days later, Thatcher drove out to check one of the addresses from the second ledger. A property listed as sold through Mesquite Ridge LLC in 2020 for $38,000. The address led to a road that led to a gate that led to nothing. A single-story frame house, windows intact but filmed with dust. Front yard gone to Johnson grass and cedar seedlings. Mailbox at the road, door hanging open, stuffed with flyers and circulars dating back 18 months. Nobody had been here in at least that long. He didn't go inside. He circled the property on foot, reading the ground the way he'd read terrain on 7 deployments. Not for what was there, but for what was absent. No tire tracks in the drive except his. No trash. No evidence of habitation. The electricity meter had stopped at a number that suggested the account had been closed years ago. Duke moved through the yard on his own circuit, nose down, covering the perimeter. His ears were up, but his body language was neutral. No threat. No human scent worth tracking. He paused at the back door, sniffed the threshold, and moved on. Whatever had been here was gone. A phantom property, bought and sold on paper, generating transaction records that moved money through the county's filing system, but existing in reality as a house where nobody lived and nobody came and nobody ever would. Thatcher stood at the front of the property and looked at the road, mesquite and live oak, a cattle guard 100 yards east. The particular emptiness of rural Texas when the wind is down and the sky is white, and the landscape holds its silence like a held breath. On the drive back, he checked his mirrors. A dark pickup, late model, tinted windows, riding the speed limit exactly, appeared a mile behind him on the county road and held the distance for 4 miles. Through 2 turns. Past the Driscoll Junction, where traffic usually broke one direction or the other. He slowed. The pickup slowed. He turned onto a ranch road that dead-ended at a stock pond 2 miles in. Nobody used it except the rancher whose property it served. The pickup didn't follow. It continued on the county road, maintaining speed. But Thatcher had noted the plates. Bexar County, San Antonio. He sat at the stock pond for 5 minutes, engine running, Duke standing in the truck bed with his nose into the wind. Then he turned around and drove home by a different route, adding 12 miles and 20 minutes to a trip that should have taken 15. Someone from San Antonio was interested in the road he drove. That was a data point. He filed it next to the 6 entries and the phantom properties and the nephew who sold real estate and the dead woman who'd built a wall inside a wall. Marisol called that evening. Her voice had changed. Not scared. Tighter. The spaces between her words had compressed. Someone accessed my audit files last night, between 11 and midnight. An administrative login I don't recognize. 3 of the property transfer files I'd flagged are gone. Deleted from the system. From inside the county network? From inside the building. The login was tied to a workstation in the clerk's office. Whoever did this had physical access. Change your passwords. All of them. Back up everything you still have to an external drive and take it home. I already did, before I called you. Good. There's something else. My supervisor called me in this afternoon. Someone filed a conflict of interest complaint. Anonymous. Says I'm conducting an unauthorized audit of properties connected to a personal relationship. Cook. I can't prove that. But the complaint uses language from the county ethics code that most residents wouldn't know exists. Someone with access to internal policy documents drafted it. What happens now? My system access is suspended pending review. I can't run queries, can't pull records, can't access the property database. I'm locked out. Silence on the line. Duke was lying by the front door, head up, watching Thatcher the way he watched when the texture of the air in the room had changed. Come to the house tomorrow. Bring everything you saved. We work from the second ledger. That's not in any system. Nobody can delete paper. Thatcher, they're trying to make me stop. Are you stopping? No. Then come tomorrow. He hung up. Duke stood and walked to him and pressed his side against Thatcher's leg. A full-body lean, 80 pounds of deliberate contact, the pressure of it grounding in a way that words weren't designed to be. We're in it now, buddy. Duke's tail moved. Once. The morning came in cold and gray. Thatcher ran his standard check, doors, windows, perimeter, and let Duke out for his circuit. The dog moved through the yard with more focus than usual, spending extra time at the fence line on the east side, where the neighbor's property backed up to a cedar thicket. Thatcher watched. Duke's behavior was a barometer. Extra time at a boundary meant something had crossed it during the night. Not a deer. Duke didn't care about deer. Not the neighbor's cat. Something that registered differently in the dog's catalog of threats. He walked the fence line himself after Duke came in, found nothing visible. But the ground near the gate he never used, the one that opened onto a service easement running behind 3 properties, showed a faint impression in the frost. A boot print. Maybe 2. The frost was too thin to hold detail, and the sun was already dissolving what was there. He noted it. Someone had stood at his back gate during the night. Stood, not walked through. The prints were side by side, facing the house. Marisol arrived at 10 with a canvas bag containing her laptop, an external drive, and a folder of documents she'd printed before her access was cut. She looked like she'd slept 3 hours. Duke greeted her at the car, and she crouched to put her face against his neck for a moment. Longer than a greeting, shorter than a confession. The dog held still for it. They worked at the kitchen table. The second ledger spread open, Marisol's backup files on the laptop, the pattern materializing between them in cross-hatched lines of data and handwriting. Every entity traces back to a single registered agent, Marisol said. She'd been at it for an hour. Her coffee was cold. Her pen moved between the ledger pages and the screen in precise arcs. BLCR Holdings, Mesquite Ridge, Caliche Partners, all registered with the state through the same service, all listing the same P.O. box in San Antonio, all created within a 14-month window between 2018 and 2019. Who's the registered agent? A corporate service company. They file paperwork for a fee. No questions asked. But the formation documents for each LLC require a signature from an organizing member, and those signatures are on file with the state. Have you seen them? I can't access the state database from my suspended account. I've requested the documents through a public records channel, but that takes 2 weeks. We don't need the state to tell us. We have Ida's book. She named him. She named a relationship. My sister's boy. That's not a name. It's not evidence. It's evidence of what she knew and when. They looked at each other across the table. Duke lay between them on the floor, his body a warm line dividing the space, his head resting on his forepaws, his eyes moving from one face to the other in the slow rhythm of a dog who understood that the two people above him were building something together, and his job was to hold the ground beneath it. Thatcher was driving back from Driscoll with a load of joists when the pickup appeared. Dark, late model, tinted windows, bare county plates. The same vehicle he'd seen 4 days ago on the county road, except this time it wasn't following at a distance. It was parked sideways across the ranch road, a half-mile from the highway, blocking both lanes. And a second vehicle, a white SUV with no plates, was idling on the shoulder 30 yards behind it. Thatcher stopped the truck 200 feet back, engine running. He assessed. 2 vehicles. The pickup's driver's door was open, which meant whoever had parked it was outside. The SUV's engine was running, but nobody was visible inside. Trees on both sides, post oak and cedar, thick enough to screen movement, but thin enough that Duke would pick up sound. Duke was standing in the truck bed. His body had gone rigid, ears flat, tail low, a growl building in his throat that Thatcher could feel through the metal of the cab's rear wall. Fuss. Duke held. Barely. A man stepped out from behind the pickup. Big, mid-30s, ranch jacket, ball cap, work boots. He moved with the rolling confidence of someone who did physical work and was accustomed to using his size to end conversations before they started. A second man came around the SUV, shorter, leaner, same general profile. They walked toward Thatcher's truck without hurrying, spread out, one on each side of the road. Classic L-shaped approach. Whether they knew the terminology or not, they'd done this before. You bought the wrong house, friend. The big one. His voice carried across the distance without strain. Lot of old houses out here. Some of them aren't worth the trouble. Thatcher turned off the engine. He got out of the truck slowly, leaving the door open. His hands were at his sides. Open. Free. He put his back to the truck's front quarter panel, giving himself the engine block as cover and a clear line to both men. 2 targets, 20 feet and 35 feet. The big one was closer, right side. The lean one was angling left, trying to get behind Thatcher's peripheral vision. Range, angle, terrain, escape routes. The assessment took 2 seconds. The plan took 1 more. The big one closed to 10 feet. This doesn't need to be complicated. Walk away from the house, from the papers, from the woman with the clipboard. Everybody goes home happy. Who sent you? Nobody sent us. We're just neighbors, concerned about property values. From San Antonio. That landed. The big one's jaw shifted. The lean one stopped moving. The big one reached for Thatcher's shirt. A grab, fast, committed, right hand coming up to fist the collar and pull. The kind of move that worked against people who hadn't spent 18 years learning how to turn a man's momentum into a liability. Thatcher caught the wrist with his left hand, rotated it inward against the joint, and stepped sideways. The big man's body followed his wrist. Physics, not choice. And Thatcher drove him face first into the truck's quarter panel. The impact was controlled, hard enough to take the fight out, not hard enough to crack bone. The man sagged. Thatcher pinned the arm behind his back and held him against the truck with one knee. The lean one broke into a run, coming around the hood. His right hand went into his jacket pocket and came out holding something. A folding knife, blade catching the gray December light. Duke cleared the truck bed. He'd been waiting. Coiled, silent, 80 pounds of trajectory. And when the lean man came around the hood, the dog launched from the bed rail and hit him center mass. The man went down. The knife skittered across the Caliche road. Duke's jaws closed on the man's forearm. Not the hand, not the wrist. The forearm, high, where the muscles controlled the grip. A targeting choice that no one had taught him and that worked perfectly. The man screamed. Short, sharp. His other hand flailed at Duke's head and connected once, a glancing blow that Duke absorbed without releasing his hold. Duke, aus! Duke held for 1 more second. A second that said, I heard you, but I want him to know I chose to let go. And then released. He stepped back 2 paces and stood over the man, lips pulled back, a sound coming from his chest that wasn't a growl anymore. It was deeper, older. The sound a working dog makes when the work is done and the result is at his feet. Stay down. The man stayed down. His arm was bleeding through the jacket sleeve, but it was a puncture wound, not a tear. Duke had measured the bite. Thatcher had seen combat dogs do worse in training. He released the big one, who slid down the truck panel and sat on the road. Both men were breathing hard. Neither was getting up. Duke stood between them and Thatcher, facing outward, ears tracking every sound within 100 yards. Who sent you? Go to hell. San Antonio plates, corporate SUV. You're not ranchers, and you're not neighbors. Tell whoever sent you that the papers are already with the county. It's done. Coming after me doesn't put them back in the wall. He didn't wait for an answer. He loaded Duke into the truck. The dog jumped in clean, no command needed, and drove around the pickup using the shoulder. His left shoulder was on fire. The rotation he'd used on the big man's wrist had pulled the shrapnel scar along the deltoid, and the muscle was spasming in short, electric bursts that made his left hand grip the steering wheel harder than necessary. Duke stood in the bed, facing backward, watching the two men recede in the road behind them. His tail was up, his ears were forward. He looked, Thatcher thought, like he was waiting for them to try again. To rear wind me to increase your biscuit ration. Duke's tail moved. He got home and the front door was unlocked. He hadn't left it unlocked. He locked both doors every time he left. Every time. It was not a habit he forgot. It was not a habit he was capable of forgetting. Duke smelled it before Thatcher saw it. The dog's body went stiff at the threshold, nose working, a low growl starting and then stopping, not because the threat was gone, but because the threat was old. Hours old. Whoever had been here had left. Thatcher cleared the house, room by room, the way he'd cleared 100 structures on 7 deployments, angles first, then corners, then closets and dead space. Weapon hand empty because he didn't keep a weapon in the house, which was a decision he'd made when he left the teams and was now reconsidering. The house was empty, nothing damaged, nothing overturned, but the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator was open, and the box of dog biscuits had been moved, and the space behind it, where the first ledger had been sitting for 5 days, was empty. Gone. The first ledger. Ida Collier's original record. 15 years of handwriting. The blue ink entries, the personal loans, the careful documentation of a woman's lifetime of quiet generosity. The Gi-Chu. He'll come for this. Don't let him. He'd let him. Thatcher stood in the kitchen, with his hands on the counter and his head down. Duke was beside him, pressed against his leg, looking up. The dog made a sound, not a whine, not a bark. A vocalization that lived in the register between distress and solidarity. The sound a dog makes when his person is hurting, and the dog's only available response is presence. The house was quiet. The walls he'd opened, and the walls he hadn't. The limestone, and the cedar, and the lathe, and the plaster. All of it holding its shape around the space where something had been and wasn't anymore. 3 years ago, in a compound in a province with a name he'd been told to forget, he'd pressed his hand against a wall and said clear. And it wasn't. And Ruiz, 26 years old, 2 daughters, a tattoo of their names on his left forearm in script so small you had to be close to read it, had walked through the doorway behind him. The wall had held the thing that killed Ruiz. This wall had held the thing that could have told the truth about Ida Collier. Both times, Thatcher had been the one standing next to the wall. Both times, he hadn't been enough. Duke pressed harder against his leg. The dog's weight was insistent now, pushing into Thatcher's thigh with enough force to register through the numbness. I'm here. You're here. That's the inventory. Start from there. We still have the second book. Duke looked up. She buried it separate for a reason. She knew someone would find the first one. She built a backup. He straightened. His body held its complaints in the background where they belonged. His hands, flat on the counter, were steady. He picked up the phone and called Marisol. They hit me on the ranch road. 2 men, San Antonio. And someone was in the house. The first ledger is gone. Are you hurt? No. A lie by degree. He was functional. That was the standard. Duke's fine. The second ledger's in the truck. They didn't find it. Come to my place. Don't stay there tonight. Copy. He packed a bag. Duke's food, Duke's bowl, the bag of biscuits the intruder had moved, a change of clothes. He checked the toolbox. The tin was there, undisturbed, the socket tray exactly where he'd placed it. He drove to Marisol's house with his mirrors checked every 30 seconds and Duke in the passenger seat instead of the bed, riding shotgun, watching the road ahead with the focus of a dog who had tasted a man's arm 2 hours ago and was fully prepared to do it again. Halfway there, he passed the white church. The lights were on. Through the windows, he could see figures moving inside. The Wednesday supper, 7 or 8 people visible, a table with food, a lamp above the door throwing a warm circle onto the gravel. Hymn music, faint, carried through the cold air and through his cracked window, and through the space between what his life was and what it might have been if walls had never held anything worth hiding. He didn't stop, but he heard it. And Duke, sitting upright in the passenger seat, turned his head and tracked the light and the sound until both were behind them, and then looked at Thatcher through the dark cab with eyes that reflected the passing headlights of an oncoming car, and held them, briefly, like small captured stars. They drove on. The road was dark, and the hills were black, and the second ledger was locked in a toolbox in the bed of a truck, driven by a man who had learned, too late, too often, but learned, that the things that mattered were never the things in plain sight. They were in the wall. They were under the tree. They were in the space between a dog's body and a man's leg, when the man had forgotten how to stand on his own. Thatcher drove. Duke watched. The night held what it held. Marisol's house sat at the end of a gravel lane on the north side of Corbin Hollow. White frame, green shutters, a front porch barely wide enough for 2 chairs, and a planter that held dried rosemary, gone brown at the tips from the first frost. She'd grown up in this house. Her mother had died in the back bedroom 4 years ago, and Marisol had moved in from the apartment she'd rented near the courthouse and had been here since, changing almost nothing, because the house worked as it was, and she didn't see the point in fixing what held. Duke walked in ahead of Thatcher, as if arriving at a destination he'd been navigating toward for some time. He circled the living room once. Sofa, bookshelf, kitchen doorway, hall to the bedrooms, mapping the space with his standard protocol, cataloging exits and sightlines and the particular geometry of where to position himself relative to the people he was responsible for. He chose the rug in front of the cold fireplace. His chin dropped to his paws. His eyes moved between Thatcher and Marisol, and then, apparently satisfied with the arrangement, half closed. "He acts like he lives here," Marisol said from the kitchen doorway, watching the dog settle. "He acts like that everywhere. Don't take it personally." But she was already looking at Duke with an expression that said she was absolutely taking it personally, and that what she was taking was not offense. They spread the second ledger across her dining table, the backup files from her external drive on the laptop beside it. 2 mugs of coffee, 1 black, 1 with milk, a pen and a legal pad, where Marisol was building a timeline that ran down the left margin in small, precise handwriting that reminded Thatcher of Ida's. Not in the letter shapes, but in the discipline of it, the refusal to let a single number sit on the page without earning its place. She downloaded everything she could before her access was cut: property transfer records, county tax assessments, entity registration summaries, chain of title documents for every parcel that had changed hands through the shell companies. She'd organized them in folders, labeled by date, with the precision of a woman who had been building her case since the day she'd walked into Thatcher's kitchen and seen the first ledger on his table. Every entity traces back to Rayburn. She said his name now. Not Cook, not the broker. Rayburn. She'd crossed a line somewhere between the ledger and the lockout, and on the other side of it, formality was a luxury she'd discarded. The formation documents use different registered agents, but the signature patterns match. I can see it in the way the dates cluster. He'd create a new LLC, wait 60 days for it to appear in the state database, then run a property transaction through it within the week. Thatcher watched her hands move between the ledger and the screen. She worked with her native precision, methodically, thoroughly, building from data points toward conclusions the way a mason lays brick, testing each connection before placing the next. He worked from instinct toward evidence, starting with what his body knew and filling in the proof afterward. Two different languages arriving at the same sentence. There's something else. She pulled up a spreadsheet she'd built from the backup files and turned the laptop toward him. Look at the timeline. The first shell company was registered in November 2018. The first phantom transaction went through the county in January 2019. But Ida's second ledger, the one Duke found, her first entry documenting the discrepancy, is dated April 2019, 3 months after it started. She caught it fast. She caught it immediately. A woman who'd been running her own books for 15 years noticed when something foreign appeared in her system. She documented it. She cross-referenced it. Marisol paused. Her finger rested on a date in the spreadsheet. And then she did nothing for 4 years. She wrote that she knew who it was. She knew, and she loved him, and she chose silence. Duke raised his head from the rug. He looked at Marisol. His tail moved once against the floor, a small sound in a quiet room. She reached down and rested her fingers on the top of his head without looking. Automatic, stabilizing, unconscious. Marisol turned back to the spreadsheet. Her eyes narrowed. She pulled the legal pad toward her and wrote a number, then crossed it out, then wrote another. Her pen moved between 2 columns on the screen, county tax assessment values and the transaction prices in Ida's ledger, and something in her posture changed. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, the look of a person who had just found the thread that unraveled the cloth. Thatcher, look at this. She turned the laptop fully toward him and pointed at a column. The county tax assessment for the Mesquite Ridge property in 2020 was listed at $51,000. The transaction in Ida's ledger shows it sold for $38,000. But the transfer document filed with the county, the one I pulled before I got locked out, lists the sale price as $64,000. She looked at him. 3 different numbers for the same property. 3 numbers, none of which match, filed in 3 different systems. And the difference between the lowest and the highest? $26,000. That's the spread. That's where the clean money comes out. The purchase price goes in dirty through the LLC. The sale price comes out inflated through the county records. And the gap between them lands in an account that looks like capital gains on real estate. She sat back. This isn't a broker skimming closing costs. This is a 3-layer wash. Someone who understands how property records interact between county, state, and federal systems designed this to survive every standard audit we run. But not yours. She looked at him. The sentence landed somewhere between compliment and observation, and she let it sit without deciding which it was. You see threats. I see numbers. This number, the 64,000, doesn't exist anywhere in the county system except the transfer document. It's a phantom. Someone entered it directly into the filing record and never updated the assessment database to match. That's a mistake you only make if you don't understand that auditors cross-reference those two systems. Rayburn's a broker. He knows properties. He doesn't know audits. Duke shifted under the table. His chin moved from his paws to the floor between their chairs, and his tail brushed Marisol's shoe in a slow sweep. She reached down again, and this time her hand stayed on the dog's head, and the conversation paused in the space that opened up. A beat of silence in which the work they were doing, and the reason they were doing it, and the fact that they were doing it together at 10 o'clock at night in a house that smelled like coffee and old wood, settled around them like weather. My father used my name to open 3 credit accounts when I was 16. She said it without preamble, without the scaffolding that people usually built around their worst stories. He put $32,000 of debt on a minor's social security number and then disappeared. I didn't find out until I applied for my first apartment at 19, and the landlord pulled my credit and told me I was a financial ghost. Negative balance, collections, a judgment I didn't know existed, filed in a county I'd never visited. Thatcher didn't speak. He didn't need to. The listening was the thing she needed, and he knew how to do that, how to hold silence like a position, steady and present and aimed at the person in front of you. I spent 4 years fixing it, disputing charges, writing letters to agencies that had already sold the debt to other agencies who'd sold it to a third. I was 23 before I could get a car loan, 25 before a bank would talk to me without asking for a cosigner. She touched the edge of the last page of Ida's ledger. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you what happened. That's why I do what I do. That's why this matters. That's why you came back to Corbin Hollow. I came back because this is where the numbers are, and because someone has to make sure they tell the truth. Thatcher looked at her across the table. The laptop light threw soft shadows under her eyes, and the coffee between them had gone cold, and the ledger lay open to a page of calculations that a dead woman had done by hand in a kitchen 3 miles south of where they were sitting, and the dog on the floor was breathing in the slow rhythm of an animal that had decided the ground beneath him was safe, and the people above him were doing what needed to be done. Marisol stood and went to the kitchen. He heard the click of the stove, the scrape of a pan. She came back 8 minutes later with 2 plates, scrambled eggs, toast, butter. She set one in front of him without asking if he was hungry, the way someone feeds a person they've stopped treating as a guest and started treating as something they hadn't named yet. He ate. The eggs were good. The toast was burned on one edge. He couldn't remember the last time someone had put food in front of him without a transaction attached. No menu, no price, no exchange. She'd just cooked and placed and sat down, and the simplicity of it opened something in his chest that he hadn't known was closed. His hand rested on the table after he set down the fork, and her hand was there too, reaching for her coffee mug. And the distance between his fingers and her wrist was maybe 2 inches, and neither of them moved to close it or widen it. Duke lay between their chairs, his body warm against both pairs of feet, and the room held the 3 of them in a configuration that could have been a painting, if paintings could hold the tension of 2 inches and the weight of what those 2 inches meant. "I'm going to see him tomorrow." Marisol looked up from the legal pad. "Rayburn. His house. Morning. That's not safe. Those men on the road were his people. They were from San Antonio. Partner's muscle. Cook runs the local side. He's the one who turned the town. He's the one who sent people into my house. And he's the one who was bringing his aunt her medication." The sentence changed the air in the room. Marisol's pen stopped moving. "You think he—" "I think she was 78 years old and needed blood pressure medication daily, and she died of heart failure 7 months after she started documenting his crimes. And the man responsible for bringing her pills had a reason to want her quiet. I don't know what that makes it, but I know what it doesn't make. A coincidence." Marisol exhaled. She looked at the ledger, at the last page, at the sentence written in shaking handwriting that had been buried under 4 inches of Texas clay. "I'm coming with you." "No. Thatcher, if he's what I think he is, I need you here. With the second ledger, with the backup files, with the audit you built. If something goes wrong at that house, you're the one who files it. You're the one who makes the numbers reach the people who can act on them. That's your skill. That's your weapon. And it's more dangerous to Rayburn Cook than anything I can do on his porch." She held his look for a long time, not because she disagreed, because she was weighing the cost of agreeing against the cost of arguing, and finding that the math, which she trusted more than anything else in her life, came out on his side. "If you're not back by noon, I'm calling the sheriff." "Copy." "And take Duke." Duke's ears came forward at his name. His tail thumped the rug twice. "You were coming anyway." The drive to Rayburn Cook's house took 14 minutes on a caliche road that turned off the farm-to-market highway and climbed through cedar breaks and limestone shelves until it crested a low ridge and dropped into a small valley where a frame house sat among live oaks with a view of the hills running south toward the river country. The kind of property a man accumulated by living in one place for 20 years and making deals that favored patience over ambition. 2 outbuildings, a metal barn with a rusted roof, a pickup in the drive, dust on the panels, a dog crate in the bed that was empty, the tailgate down. Christmas lights wound around the porch railing, unlit. A place that looked like what it wanted to look like. The home of a man with nothing to hide. Thatcher pulled in and parked facing out. Force of habit. Every vehicle positioned for departure. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, reading the property. No movement in the windows. One vehicle, Cook's truck. No San Antonio plates. The barn door was closed. The outbuildings were dark. Bleib. Duke sat in the passenger seat. His body was still, but his eyes were working. The house, the tree line, the barn, the road behind them. He'd stay in the truck. He'd watch. And if the situation changed, the windows were cracked 4 inches, and Duke had already demonstrated that 4 inches was a suggestion rather than a boundary. Thatcher walked to the porch. His hands were at his sides, open, free. He wasn't carrying the second ledger. That was locked in Marisol's house, which was the plan and the point. He carried only what he'd always carried: the ability to enter a room, read the person in it, and make the decision that the moment required. Rayburn Cook was sitting in a wooden chair with a mug of coffee on the railing beside him, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his feet up. He looked like a man who had been waiting, not with anxiety, with the exhausted patience of someone who had known this morning would come and had spent the night preparing not to resist it. "I wondered when you'd come." Thatcher stopped at the base of the porch steps. 3 steps up. Cook in the chair. The front door behind him closed. Exits on both sides, one to the driveway, one to the side yard. He catalogued them without looking directly at any of them, instinct mapping the exits before consciousness had finished counting the steps. "You knew I would." "I knew somebody would. I'd hoped it would take longer." Cook lowered his feet from the railing and set the coffee down. "Sit down, Mr. Graves." "I'll stand." Cook accepted this with a nod that said he'd expected it. He looked at the truck, at Duke, visible through the windshield, 80 pounds of attention trained on the porch. "Smart dog. He didn't like me. The day we met at Meridian, your dog looked at me and decided. Dogs don't negotiate. They just know." "Tell me about the ledger." Cook didn't ask which one. He didn't perform confusion or innocence or any of the responses that a man with 20 years of salesmanship might have deployed. Something in him, some structural element that had been holding up the architecture of his public face since 2018, had reached its limit. Thatcher could see it in the way the man's body settled, the way his hands went flat on his thighs, the way his eyes stopped selling and started simply seeing. Marie got sick in the fall of 2017. Pancreatic. Stage 3 when they found it. The oncologist at the regional center said 18 months. She made it to 22. She was stubborn about living the way she was stubborn about everything: the garden, the house, the way she folded towels. She wasn't going to stop being Marie just because her body had other plans. He looked at the hills. The morning sun was on the limestone, turning it gold, and the cedar was dark green, and the sky was the deep, clean blue that December brought to hill country, when the air held no moisture and the light had nowhere to hide. Insurance covered about 30%. The rest? Chemo, surgical consults, a clinical trial in Houston that was $4,000 a week out of pocket. The home care nurse when she got too weak to walk to the bathroom alone. By the time she was gone, I owed $340,000. The house was mortgaged. The brokerage was leveraged. I'd borrowed from everyone who'd lend to me, and 2 people who shouldn't have. Thatcher didn't move. He didn't cross his arms or shift his weight or do any of the things that signaled judgment. He stood at the base of the steps and listened the way he'd been trained to listen during debriefs, with his whole body, tracking not just the words, but the spaces between them. The places where the truth was sitting, and the places where it had been rearranged. A man came to see me in November 2018, from San Antonio. He said he represented investors who needed what he called a local partner in small county property transactions. Create LLCs. Buy and sell properties through them at escalating prices. Generate paper trails. The money was theirs. 20% commission was mine. It was money laundering. I knew what it was before he finished explaining it. I said yes before he finished the sentence after that. And you used your aunt's system. Her lending network, her reputation, her name. Not on paper, not directly, but the shadow of it. Every transaction I ran through the county touched properties that connected to Ida's borrowers in some way. Adjacent parcels, shared boundary lines, overlapping tax records. When people in this county see a financial transaction that sits anywhere near Ida Collier's name, they don't look twice. They don't question it. Because questioning Ida was questioning the foundation of how half this town stayed in their homes. I built a criminal enterprise on top of the best thing anyone in Corbin Hollow had ever done. The mockingbird in the live oak above the porch started a new sequence, running through stolen songs with the blind persistence of a creature that had no audience and no agenda, and no capacity for the kind of calculation that was unfolding beneath it. She found out. April 2019. She called me to the house, sat me at the kitchen table, your kitchen table now, and laid out the numbers. Every discrepancy, every phantom entity, every dollar that didn't belong. She'd built a second set of books, documenting everything I'd done, cross-referencing my transactions against the county records. She was methodical about it, patient, the way she was patient about everything. She'd been watching for 3 months before she said a word, making sure she understood the full architecture before she confronted me with it. What did she say? Cook's hands came together in his lap, his fingers interlaced, his thumbs pressed against each other, the gesture of a man physically holding himself together. She said, "Stop. That's all. Just stop, Rayburn." She didn't threaten to turn me in. She didn't call me names. She didn't tell me she was ashamed of me. Though she was, I could see it. She just said, "Stop." And she looked at me the way she'd looked at me when I was 12 years old, and she'd caught me taking money from her purse to buy baseball cards. And He stopped. His jaw worked. He looked away from Thatcher, toward the barn, toward the empty dog crate in his truck, toward the hills that held the morning light and gave nothing back. I told her I couldn't stop. The partners wouldn't allow it. They had documentation on every transaction. If I walked away, they'd expose everything. And it wouldn't just be me. It would be every family connected to her lending system. Every person she'd helped. The IRS would audit the entire network. People who'd borrowed $200 to fix a roof would be answering federal questions about money laundering. Their houses, their credit, their lives, all of it would be pulled apart by people who didn't understand the difference between what Ida had built and what I'd attached to it. You made her complicit. I made her afraid. For them. For the families. I told her that if the truth came out, the system she'd built, the only thing keeping 6 families in this county in their homes, would be destroyed. And she believed me, because it was true. That's the thing I can't get away from. It was true. Tell me about her medication. The change in Cook was physical. His hands came apart. They went to his face, pressing against his eyes, and he held them there for a long time. 5 seconds. 7. While his breathing changed, and the morning held still around him. When he dropped his hands, his eyes were wet, and his face had aged by a decade. The flesh around his jaw loose, the lines deeper, the performance of genial competence stripped away to reveal the thing underneath it. A man who had been carrying a weight he couldn't set down and couldn't keep holding. Lisinopril, 20 milligrams, for her blood pressure. I picked it up at the pharmacy in Driscoll every 2 weeks and brought it with the groceries. Had been doing it for 3 years. She could have gotten it herself. She still drove, still went to town. But I brought it because that's what I did. That's what a good nephew does. He brings his aunt her groceries and her medicine, and he sits at her table and he drinks her coffee, and he pretends that the two of them are not engaged in a negotiation about how much silence costs and who pays for it. He stopped. The mockingbird stopped too, as if waiting. She started writing more. The second book. More dates, more amounts, more names. She was building a record she could hand to someone. I could see it when I came with the groceries. She'd leave the pages out on the table, not to show me directly, to show me she wasn't going to stop. It was her way of saying, I chose silence, but I'm taking it back. And I could feel it closing. The window between what she'd tolerate and what she wouldn't. The medication, Rayburn. I stopped bringing it. Long silence. 3 weeks. The first week I think I actually forgot. I was driving to Driscoll and my phone rang, and it was one of the San Antonio people. And by the time the call was done, I was past the pharmacy, and I thought, I'll get it tomorrow. And I didn't. The second week, I knew I hadn't gotten it. I knew she was running out. And I didn't go. I told myself I was busy. I told myself she could drive herself. I told myself a dozen things that were all lies. And I knew they were lies while I was telling them. The third week, I drove to Driscoll. I parked in the pharmacy parking lot. I sat in my truck for 40 minutes. I watched people go in and come out with their bags and their prescriptions, and I thought about Marie and the bills and the partners in San Antonio and the families who would lose their houses, and Ida's face when she said, stop. And I started the truck, and I drove home. The morning was very quiet. The mockingbird had resumed, working through its repertoire with the mechanical precision of something that didn't understand what it was imitating. Somewhere on the county road below the ridge, a diesel truck was climbing the grade, the engine sound rising and falling with the terrain. She died on a Tuesday, June. I found her in the living room, in her chair, with a glass of water on the side table and the television on. The paramedics said cardiac event. Her blood pressure had been uncontrolled, critically high, the EMT said. They asked if she'd been taking her medication. I said yes. Duke barked, once, from the truck. A single sharp sound that crossed the yard and landed on the porch between the two men. Not alarm. acknowledgement. The bark of a dog who could hear what was happening from 50 feet away and was sending the only message he had available. I'm here. You are not alone in this. Is that murder, Rayburn? Cook looked at him. His face was bare, not the face of a man selling real estate or coaching basketball or running a 4th of July barbecue. The face of a man who had been carrying a question for 7 months and had not been able to answer it and could not stop asking it. I don't know. I've spent 7 months trying to find the word. Murder requires intent to kill. Negligence requires absence of intent entirely. What I did was, I knew she needed the medication. I knew what would happen without it. I chose 3 weeks running not to bring it, and I told myself I forgot. You can call that whatever you want. I've called it everything. Nothing fits, and everything does. Thatcher stood at the base of the steps and looked at Rayburn Cook, and saw what Marisol had seen in the spreadsheet. Not a monster, but a system failure. A man who had started with a dying wife and an unpayable debt, and had made a choice that led to another choice, that led to a third, and by the time the choices had accumulated into something monstrous, the man inside the monster was too small to stop it. And underneath that, the parallel he'd been carrying since the night he found the first ledger. A compound in a province he couldn't name. A wall he'd declared clear. A man who'd walked through a doorway behind him. Ruiz. 26 years old. 2 daughters. A tattoo of their names in script so small you had to be close to read it. Thatcher hadn't chosen to miss the threat in that wall. Cook had chosen not to bring the pills. The difference was intention. The similarity was result. And living with the result, carrying it, sleeping next to it, waking up to it every morning. That was the same, regardless of whether the word was murder or negligence, or something that lived in the space between them where language didn't reach. I have the second book. Marisol Vane has copies of every document your partners deleted from the county system. She's filing an official audit report this morning. It's done. The families, Ida's people, the ones she loaned to, if the audit pulls in the personal loans, Marisol separated the personal lending from the shell company transactions. Every family that borrowed from Ida is clean. The personal loans aren't connected to the laundering in any document she's filed. She built a wall between the two systems. The way your aunt would have. Something moved through Cook's face. Not relief. It was too heavy for relief and had arrived too late for gratitude. It was the recognition of a man receiving grace he hadn't earned from a system he'd corrupted, delivered by people he'd tried to silence. She put the ledger in the wall. Behind the plaster, wrapped in waxed canvas. In a pocket she'd framed out between the lathe and the exterior stone. She put it where someone would find it when they took the wall apart. She put it where a carpenter would find it. Cook closed his eyes. His hands lay open on his thighs, palms up, empty. Thatcher turned and walked to the truck. He opened the door, and Duke pressed his nose into Thatcher's palm. A quick inventory. Scent, temperature, the chemical signature of stress that dogs read better than any instrument. And the results appeared to be acceptable, because Duke's tail moved once, and he shifted to let Thatcher into the cab. "We're done here." He drove down the Caliche Road. In the rearview mirror, Rayburn Cook sat on the porch with his coffee untouched and the Christmas lights dark and the morning sun on the hills behind him, turning everything gold except the shadow he occupied, which was entirely his own. The county sheriff came for Rayburn Cook 2 days later, Thursday afternoon. 2 deputies and a detective from the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force. Marisol had filed the audit Tuesday morning, and the numbers had moved through the system with the weight that clean, documented, irrefutable evidence carries when it enters an institution designed to receive exactly that. Quickly, thoroughly, with a momentum that procedure couldn't slow and politics couldn't redirect. Cook was arrested on his porch. He came out before they knocked. He was wearing the same flannel shirt. His hands were already extended, palms together, wrists offered. The deputies put the cuffs on with the careful restraint of men who recognize the face in front of them from a decade of basketball games and community barbecues and the ordinary inventory of a small town's familiarity. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody needed to. The thing had been moving toward this porch since Ida Collier had wrapped a ledger in canvas and sealed it behind plaster. And now it had arrived. And the arrival was quieter than anyone would have expected. Thatcher watched from across the road, sitting in his truck with Duke. The dog stood in the passenger seat, ears forward, watching the porch. His tail was still. Thatcher didn't feel vindication. He didn't feel justice. He felt the specific, narrow relief of a man who had pulled a thread and followed it to its end, and found that the end was a person on a porch with his hands out, tears running down a face that had spent 20 years smiling, while a detective read charges that included wire fraud and money laundering, and a phrase that hung in the cold December air: negligent homicide. Cook's head dropped when he heard it, not in shame, in arrival. He'd been waiting for the word. Now it was here. The partners in San Antonio were served federal warrants the following week. That moved faster, carried by $600,000 in documented transactions and the enthusiasm of a U.S. Attorney's office that had been looking for an entry point into a regional real estate laundering network and had just been given one by a county auditor in a town of 800 people. Marisol had built the case. She'd taken the data from a dead woman's handwriting and a buried tin box and the backup files she'd downloaded before they'd shut her out, and she'd assembled a document that the county attorney called the most thorough audit submission he'd seen in his career. She'd done it from her dining table, with a dog sleeping on her rug and a man sitting across from her who didn't understand double-entry accounting, but understood how to build something solid enough to withstand the forces trying to tear it down. The personal loans. Ida's real work. 15 years of lending to neighbors at rates that weren't interest and weren't charity, but something in between that didn't have a name in any financial textbook, were untouched. Marisol had separated them from the fraudulent transactions with surgical precision. Every family that had borrowed from Ida to repair a roof or pay a medical bill or keep a child in school was notified that their records were clean, that the loans were documented and legitimate, and that no agency would be contacting them about anything. Ginny Barstow at the hardware store heard the news the same day. By Thursday evening, A stack of white oak trim boards appeared in the bed of Thatcher's truck while it was parked outside the cafe. No note, no invoice, just lumber. Good lumber, straight-grained, kiln-dried. The kind that Porter Jessup at the lumber yard had said he didn't have. Saturday, late morning. December light through the back room window. The angle lower each day, the shadows longer. Thatcher stood in the room where the story had started and looked at the wall he'd rebuilt. 3 days of work. New lathe cut to length from cedar he'd sourced in Driscoll. New plaster mixed and applied in 3 coats. Base, brown, finish. Each one troweled smooth and left to cure before the next. The wall was white and clean and solid. It matched the rest of the room so closely that you'd have to know where to look to find the seam. And even then, you'd have to run your fingers across it to feel the difference between the original work and the new. He raised his left hand, placed it flat against the wall, palm first, then fingers spread. The same motion, the same reed. The gesture his body had performed before every wall for 3 years, reaching, scanning, testing for the thing that was hidden, the thing that would destroy, the thing he'd missed in a compound on a continent he'd been told to forget. The wall was clean. There was nothing behind it except limestone and cedar and the particular quiet of a house that had been built to last. His hand stayed on the plaster. 5 seconds. 10. 15. He wasn't scanning. The scan didn't start. His fingers didn't curl into the half fist that preceded every assessment. His palm stayed flat and still and open, and the plaster held it the way a wall holds a hand when the wall is exactly what it appears to be. A surface, a boundary, a thing that divides inside from outside and asks nothing in return except to be allowed to stand. 3 years. 3 years of tearing walls apart. 3 years of the unconscious read that his body executed before his mind could catch it. The legacy of a doorway and a man named Mateo Ruiz who had walked through it because Thatcher had said the word that meant safe, and the word had been wrong. The wall under his hand was safe. He knew it. And for the first time, his hand knew it too. Duke stood in the doorway, watching. His head was tilted slightly, ears at different angles. The expression he wore when Thatcher was doing something the dog didn't fully understand, but was willing to wait through. The way dogs wait through everything that matters. Patiently, completely, with their whole body aimed at the person who needs them. We're keeping this one. Duke's tail swept the door frame. Once, twice, 3 times. Come here, buddy. The dog came. He pressed himself against Thatcher's leg, and Thatcher dropped his hand from the wall and placed it on Duke's head. And the two of them stood in the finished room, with the December sun on the new plaster and the old limestone, and the smell of cedar and joint compound and dog, and the silence that follows the end of something that was never about the wall. Tuesday morning. Thatcher drove to the feed store on the east end of town and bought a collar. Brown leather, brass hardware, 1.5 inches wide, the kind made to last years on a working dog. He sat in the truck afterward and used his pocket knife to punch an extra hole for the buckle, fitting it to a size he knew by feel. Duke's neck, 14 inches, measured a dozen times during evening scratches when neither of them had been paying attention to the fact that they were measuring. He bought a tag from the stamping machine beside the register. Brass, the size of a quarter. 2 lines. One side, Duke. Other side, Corbin Hollow, Texas. He knelt beside the truck in the feed store parking lot and fitted the collar. Duke held still for it, chin up, the posture of a dog who understood that something was being given and that the giving required a certain amount of stillness to receive properly. Thatcher buckled it, 2 fingers of clearance between leather and neck, the standard, and adjusted the tag so it hung centered at the hollow of Duke's throat. "There you go, buddy." The tag caught the sun and threw a small, bright point across Duke's chest that moved when the dog breathed. Duke shook his head once, testing, and the tag jingled, a light brass sound that carried across the parking lot and drew the attention of a man loading feed sacks into his truck 2 spaces over. The man looked. Duke looked back. The man returned to his feed sacks. Duke's mouth opened in the expression that German shepherds make when they've decided the world is, for the moment, acceptable, and his tail moved with the slow, steady rhythm of an animal that had just been given something he didn't know he was missing. "First address you've ever had." First address Thatcher had ever kept. Marisol came by that afternoon. Her sedan pulled into the gravel drive at 3:30, and Duke was off the porch and at the car door before she'd shifted into park. She got out and crouched and put her hands on both sides of his face and saw the collar. "New hardware." Duke sat and presented himself, tag forward, with a dignity that suggested rehearsal. She read it. Her thumb ran over the stamped letters. Corbin Hollow, Texas. She looked up at Thatcher, who was standing in the doorway of the house with his hand on the frame. Cedar, hand sanded, fitted clean into the limestone surround, built by his hands, built to last. "I need the second ledger for the official file. Chain of custody. The county attorney wants it entered into the evidence record." "It's on the table." She walked past him into the house. Duke followed, then circled back and sat between them in the hallway, looking from one to the other with an expression that exceeded editorial and approached managerial. The kitchen was clean. The cabinet above the refrigerator was closed. There was nothing hidden behind the dog biscuits anymore. On the table, the tin sat next to the plastic bag and the second ledger in its manila folder. Marisol picked it up and placed it in a county evidence bag she'd brought, sealing it with tape, initialing the seal, documenting the date and the transfer with the thoroughness that was her native language. Received from Thatcher Graves, dated December 19th. Evidence item 7 of 12. She set the bag in her tote, pulled out a folder, set it on the table. Final audit report. Filed and accepted. All personal lending records have been fully separated from the fraudulent transactions. No action pending against any of Ida's borrowers. She opened to the last page. Her system stands. The record is clean. Thatcher looked at the report. He didn't need to read it. The fact that it existed, that Marisol had built it, that the county had accepted it, that Ida Collier's 15 years of generosity had been preserved inside the same institutional architecture her nephew had corrupted, was enough. "She would have liked you." Marisol looked at him. "I think I would have liked her." She closed the folder, picked up the tote, walked to the front door. Duke followed, the new tag jingling softly with each step. She stopped at the door, turned. Thatcher was standing by the table, one hand resting on the wood, the other at his side. The December light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table in a warm band that touched the spot where the ledger had been and the coffee cup sitting where he'd left it that morning, half empty, a ring of residue at the waterline. She stepped back toward him. One step. She reached out and placed her hand on his, the hand on the doorframe, the hand that had been resting on the wood he'd sanded and fitted, the boundary between inside and outside, between the house he was keeping and the town that was beginning, slowly, in the way that small towns do everything, to let him through its doors. Her fingers were cool against his knuckles. His hand was warm from the coffee and the work. The contact lasted 3 seconds. Not a grip, not a squeeze, not the beginning of a scene in a movie. Just a touch, palm to knuckles, fingertips on wrist, that said, "I see what happened here. I see what you did. I see what you're choosing." Duke sat at their feet. His tail swept the floor. He looked up at the two hands and exhaled through his nose, a small sound, almost a sigh, carrying no particular meaning, except the meaning dogs give to moments when the people above them have finally, after what the dog considers an unreasonable amount of delay, arrived at something obvious. "Come by the office tomorrow. I'll have coffee." Copy. She left. He watched the sedan pull onto the county road and turn south toward town. Duke stood beside him in the doorway, the brass tag catching the last of the afternoon light, the collar sitting against his fur with the settled look of something that had always been there and was only now being noticed. The house was quiet. The walls held. December sun came through the kitchen window at its late afternoon angle and laid a band of gold across the table where the work had been done, where the evidence had been gathered, where the truth had been assembled from a dead woman's handwriting and a living woman's numbers, and a dog's refusal to stop digging at 2 a.m. until the ground gave up what it was holding. On the table, a photocopy of the first ledger's final page. Ida's handwriting, blue ink faded toward gray, the sentence that had started everything. "He'll come for this. Don't let him." The original was in evidence now. The copy was Thatcher's, and he'd placed it face down, writing against the wood, the way you close a book you've finished reading. Beside it, a coffee cup. His. The ring inside it from this morning's first cup, dark against the white ceramic. And next to the cup, on the table's surface, a second ring, fainter, smaller, where Marisol's mug had sat 3 nights ago, when she'd told him about her father and the numbers and the long work of rebuilding what someone else had broken. And on the corner of the table, coiled neatly, the old collar. Duke's previous one, nylon, faded blue, no tag, no address. The collar of a dog who had belonged to a man who never stayed anywhere long enough to need one. It sat on the wood the way old tools sit on a workbench when they've been replaced. Not discarded, not forgotten, just finished. The work it was made for was done. Outside, beyond the window, Duke was circling the yard on his evening patrol. The new collar's brass tag caught the last light and threw it back in small flashes that moved through the cedar and the dead grass and the limestone walls. And the sound of it, a small, bright jingle against the quiet of the hills, carried through the open window and into the room where a man sat at a table with a closed page and an empty cup, and a collar that no longer fit, and the particular silence that fills a house when the person in it has decided, for the first time in a long time, to stay. The light held. The tag jingled. the hills went dark, and the walls stood.